So why don't we just open with a word of prayer? Why don't we just open with our Father, in the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses.
Presentation tonight ends.
And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Okay, so we're launching here. This is the first quarter, so the first 4-week quarter of a 3-quarter course that we're calling Discovering the Catholic Church in America. And so what we're doing is in the first quarter, we're looking at spaces. So we're looking at the buildings of the Catholic Church in America. In the second week, we're looking at important places, or in the second quarter. So we'll be looking at important shrines and historical locations of the Catholic Church around the United States. And then the third week, or third quarter, which will be after like in February or March, we'll be looking at faces. So spaces, places, and faces. And in faces, we're going to look at important figures from the life of the Catholic Church in America. And a sort of supplemental textbook, if you would, for this course is the 10-part video documentary that we produced this last year called American Pilgrimages. Some of you have seen it. Lane produced a 10-part documentary about the history of the Catholic Church in America. And a lot of the things that we'll be exploring and talking about this year, there's some great material and references in that course. And so that is available to everyone through Lane. We'll, I think, have links for it for you in the thing, and we'll get them all sent out. So, in fact, it might be helpful for you to watch a couple of those episodes before next week, because we're talking about some of the landmark locations for the Catholic Church in America, some of its most beautiful and remarkable spaces. So,
how do we get on those sites? That site.
You follow a link, and they're on YouTube, and you follow the link that will be sent, and just watch it on YouTube.
She's going to send us something?
Yeah, or you log in through the Lane account, and they're posted there, the links. So we'll make sure that that's real clear, and you'll get an email about that. All right, so for tonight, I want to talk about sort of the history of Catholic church buildings. And we have buildings, churches, Catholic spaces, sacred spaces. And I want to talk about how we came to have them and why they look the way that they do after 2,000 years. And to sort of get into the story, maybe frame not only tonight's conversation, but the next few weeks, I want to share a personal anecdote about a little bit about my story, how I came to be here and to be teaching this class and to be part of the Catholic Church. And it was a little bit of, I'll share the anecdote with you, a little bit of some questions about Catholic Church architecture as part of my reasons. So from about 2010, year 2000 to around 2011 or something like that, for about a 10-11 year period, I worked for a series of church architecture and design firms, either as an employee or as a contract consultant. And I worked for some of the largest church architecture firms in the United States and in America and in the world, really. These were evangelical megachurch buildings. The average sanctuary, we call them sanctuary, seating room space, that we did with the firms that I worked with was somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 seats in the church. And these were churches that would average 5 to 10 to 15 or 20,000 people a weekend in attendance. And as I said, I worked for a series of these firms. I worked for a couple of years as an employee for a couple of them. And then I did contract consulting work with them on and off. And it was really remarkable. I got to see and meet all of these churches all around the United States. I got to go to South America, to China, lots of very interesting things in the course of that. And learning about and working with these evangelical megachurch architects. And some of the biggest and most famous names that you would have heard, most famous megachurches in the world. One of the architects I worked with did Joel Osteen's church, where where the Rockets, Houston Rockets play, the arena, and converted it into Joel Osteen's church. That was one of the firms, Morris Architects in Houston, that I worked on and off with. And I learned a lot about it. And I want to say some things about it because I'm trying to frame this conversation tonight about Catholic church architecture. So that's kind of why I'm telling you the story. The goal in designing those buildings was to create immersive experiences for people. Immersive experiences that drew on pop culture, entertainment, technology to create, this kind of immersive, engaging, emotional experience. And these were, like I said, rooms with maybe 5,000 seats. A couple of the firms that I worked with did a lot of work in Las Vegas with the Cirque du Soleil shows. So for on and off for a number of years, one of my jobs was to take megachurch pastors to Vegas and take them to dinner and Cirque du Soleil shows. And then I would get backstage passes to Ka and Osho and all these Beatles love and all the cool spaces there. And then we'd go out to dinner with the architects and we talk about, how they want their megachurch to feel this immersive experience, like you're going to a Cirque du Soleil show, and how they could do that. And that really kind of was the goal for the evangelical megachurch in the, around the turn of the 21st century. Now, along the way, I was also sort of investigating and considering Catholicism, and I was starting to have some discomfort with what we were doing and whether what we were doing was actually a good thing or not. And so while I was working on and off in that world, I was also, as I said, sort of investigating Catholicism and studying and learning. And a lot of this came to a head around 2010, 2011. Now that was about 4 years before I walked in the front door of Our Lady of the Lake. So I want to become a Catholic. But I was at that time, I had been working on and off with a guy who's probably one of the most prominent and well-known evangelical megachurch architects in America, maybe the world. I'll just say his name is Mel, and he owns a firm that when I worked with them, they had in the mid 2000s and the late 2000, 2009, 8, 9, 10, they had studios in Los Angeles, Denver, and Atlanta. And Mel, the founding principal, had been a Disney Imagineer. And he had designed some really well-known spaces at the Disney resorts, these just immersive spaces. He did downtown Disney in Anaheim, he did California Adventure, he did stuff with Disney in Paris and all these things. And again, the whole idea was to create these immersive visual and emotional experiences when you go into those kinds of places, right? So he left Disney and started bringing all of his skills to building those kinds of buildings and campuses for evangelical megachurches. So you felt like you were going to a Disney environment. And it was incredible. I could just tell you stories about how amazing walking into these places and these campuses were, just astounding. And Mel is very famous. In fact, the architects that were going to be here in a couple of weeks, when I was getting to know them, I mentioned Mel, and they go, oh my gosh, Mel, blah, blah, blah. I know Mel, I work with Mel, and they're like, oh my gosh, Mel is, so well known in this world. So I'm just framing all this. Well, here's where my kind of break with Mel came, and it came in an email. And I want to share with you the email exchange that Mel and I had about 4 years before I walked into the front door of the lake. So Mel had sent this email out to a bunch of people on his distribution list. And the conversation was around whether buildings can be sacred. So here's the story. Mel sends this email one day and to however many people are on the distribution list. And he says, oh my gosh, did you see what this guy did? Now, this guy's Massimiliano Locatelli. He is, you can tell he's a very stylish Italian architect in Milan. You can tell he's very stylish and Italian because he looks very stylish and Italian, and he's in Milan. And what he did, he's a very famous architect in Milan, Italy. and does all kinds of work around Europe and around the world. And what he did in the middle of Milan was for his own studio, so for his company's own studio, they bought Chiesa San Paolo Converso. This is the Church of the Conversion of St. Paul in Milan. And the Diocese of Milan was no longer using it, and Locatelli bought it for his firm and decided to turn the Church of the Conversion of St. Paul into his studio. And so what they began to do was you see that giant glass box that's up over the altar? They began to build structures inside of it. This now that became the lobby. When you came into his architecture firm, this was like a cool waiting room area. And this is what they did is they took the nave, or part of the nave, and turned it into the main office structure. So they built this steel superstructure, and everybody gets a glass cubicle. And if you're lucky, you get a glass cubicle up against the frescoes and the art. Like, that's a pretty cool office right there with all of the frescoes over you on the barrel vault. That would be a pretty cool conference room, right? And they built a tennis court in it.
Sure.
So Mel sends this email to a bunch of us and goes, "Did you see what Massimiliano Locatelli did with his studio? And this is so cool. This is so awesome. I just blah 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 blah." And like I said, I was about 4 years from walking in the door here, and I was like, it makes me uncomfortable. And so I replied back to Mel and I said, "I don't know, Mel. It's pretty cool looking. But," I said, "it bothers me because it feels like you've desecrated sacred space." And Mel's response to me was, "Buildings can't be sacred. Buildings are buildings. What you do in them can be sacred, and how you utilize them. And you can create immersive, cool experiences in them. But there's nothing sacred about a building." And we had a little email exchange, and it was clear that I was really uncomfortable. We were on different sides of the table on this, and I know, well, now Mel's never going to invite me to go on a conference again and do any work for him again. But in any case, I began to realize that, in fact, buildings can be sacred. And so the three questions, actually there's four, three questions I want to talk about tonight. And the first is this: was the church ever supposed to have buildings in the first place? We'll get into that in a minute. Because a lot of people say, well, the church never was supposed to have buildings. There's never supposed to be sacred spaces. The church is people. The church is love. The church is the Holy Spirit, not buildings. That's something that got added by the medieval Catholic Church. Secondly, how did Catholic Church buildings evolve over time? How is it that we sit in the kinds of buildings that we sit in today? When we go and see the great cathedrals or basilicas, or even your parish church, how did how did Christians go from Pentecost to having La Sagrada Familia, right? Or whatever. How did we get there? And then the third question is this: how have American Catholic Church buildings changed over the last 50 or so years? Because you can go around this country and see buildings that were built before around 1970 and buildings that were built after 1970. Okay? And it's a pretty stark architectural break. So what I'd like to do is kind of walk you through these three things tonight, all right? Any questions? Comments?
So far.
All right. So first, was the church ever supposed to have buildings in the first place? All right. It's pretty common to hear, especially in Protestant circles, and especially in Protestant evangelical circles, this line: the church isn't a building. You ever heard this? You ever said it? Right? The church isn't a building. The church is the people, right? This is the thing. This is this people, and open it up, and here's a little people, right? But the church isn't a building. The church is people. Now, this is true, but sort of a tedious observation, in my opinion, because of course the church is not a building. No one ever said it was. The church is the assembled people of God. It's the mystical body of Christ. Each of its members are living stones being built into the new temple of the Holy Spirit. You know who says that? Peter, 1 Peter 2:5. You are living stones being built into the new temple of the Holy Spirit. As far as I know, no one has ever said the church is a building. So to make the point, church isn't a building is like, well, yeah, okay. But see, I think it's a misunderstanding of the etymology, which is the origin of the word and how we get to the word church. Okay? It amounts to a difference between two concepts. The church, capital C, the church, and churches. Okay? And you know etymology, the origin of language, how words develop over time. So in the early centuries of Christianity, you can go back and look at the Roman writers in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. They would talk about different kinds of churches. One of the terms they used was domus ecclesia, which gets translated often as house church. Okay, and we'll talk about house church thing in a bit. They also had another term, aula, A-U-L-A, the aula ecclesia. Which is basically a church in an assembly hall or a converted building. And they had another term called a basilica ecclesia, which was a church in a sort of an official assembly, sort of an official structural style. And I'm going to show you some slides to show you what all these look like in a few minutes. But what happened was over time, you know, the Romans were talking about, well, it's a domus ecclesia, or it's an aula ecclesia, or it's a basilica ecclesia. You know, at some point, people just go, you know, it's an ecclesia. Ecclesia is the word for church. Okay? It comes from the Greek ecclesia, to be called out, the people of God. So they would just sort of say, hey, it's a domus ecclesia, it's a this kind of ecclesia. No, it's a house church, it's a basilica church, it's a hall church, it's a whatever. And at some point along the way, people are just going, well, it's a church, right? And so the word church partly gets a shorthanded attachment to the building, where a church is a building where the church meets. Does that make sense? And again, to the best of my knowledge, no credible author, or Catholic author certainly, has ever said in 2,000 years that the church is a building. But the church has church buildings, which are shorthand or often called churches. Does that all make sense? Okay. So the question still stands, though. Did Jesus ever intend for the church to have church buildings? Right? What do you think?
They did.
What's
You
that?
need a place to meet.
Yeah.
That's
But
what
is
a
that
church
Jesus'
really is.
intention? Was his intention that, you know, I mean, I'm just playing the devil's advocate here a little bit, because you'll hear people say, Jesus never meant that. It was supposed to be a movement of people and spirit, and we go out into society, and he never intended the churches to own property and spend all this money on buildings and property. The church should be giving that money to the poor and just be, you know, meeting informally, right? Have y'all heard that? Because I've heard that a lot my whole Christian life. And we'll get into this in a little bit, because it became supervised. One of the reasons why the design and the architecture of church buildings changed so dramatically after 1970. Yeah. The anti-building argument, I'm going to call it that, the argument that comes from certain sort of Christians who say the church should really own all this property and spend all of this money building buildings, contends that, you know, they look for biblical examples to say, well, when the veil in the temple was torn in two at the crucifixion, you know, God never intended us to have any temples. God never intended us to have tabernacles. God never intended us, you know, we're supposed to be living stones. But the problem is right in the book of Acts, you know what we find? That in Paul's letters, the book of Acts and Paul's letters, the church was meeting in facilities, in spaces. And if there's at least 5 particular ones, well, 6 that are mentioned in Scripture. Okay? The first is that in the first days after Pentecost, do you remember where they were meeting? Where?
The Seneca.
Well, in the upper room, but then after that, they were meeting in the temple courts. They were gathering in the temple courts. Then what we have is 5 named house churches. Okay, there were I could name them all for you right now. 5. Paul lists at least 5 specific house churches. The church in Philippi, Lydia's house, the church of Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus, right? And there were these at least 5 different places. And the church in Antioch was in a house. Okay, so we know that the church was meeting indoors in spaces in Paul's day, and he is commending them to do that. But still, the argument comes, and we'll get to the house churches in a minute. I've got some slides for you and all that to show you what some of those house churches look like. But nevertheless, the argument becomes, well, that's fine. They just kind of met in people's homes. And that was all it was. Now, back in my ministry career, I helped personally planted 3 churches. So I was the founding pastor of 3 different church plants, and I consulted with other church plants. And all of them started in my house. Where Linda and I moved to south of Santa Barbara right after seminary, and we just started meeting, had a Bible study meeting in our living room, and the Bible study in our living room got a little bigger, and then we rented a place at the local school, and blah blah blah. And I did that 2 other times in my career. So part of that came out of this house church movement that everybody comes over and we sit around the couches and we lounge and we have some pizza and we have Bible study and we have this intimacy of fellowship, and that's the church. I mean, that was kind of the argument. That's pure church, man. Not having all these buildings and stained glass and all of this stuff and blowing all of this money that could be given to the poor. We should all go to Carla's house and have a Bible study. That's the church. Right? You ever met this kind of mindset? Well, here's the problem with that a little bit. The New Testament was written before they needed bigger spaces. So if you look at the New Testament letters, look at the book of Acts, look at Paul's letters, they were all written in the late 50s, 60s, maybe the latest of the New Testament letters gets written in the 70, maybe. And then there's an argument about when the Revelation of John was written. Most estimates are in the 80s or 90. But the thing is that this is a time when the church was in an infant state. Okay, it was extremely small. It did meet in houses because the number of people was relatively small. But historically, what we know for a fact is that as soon as there began to be more people, you know what they began to do? Get bigger spaces. I mean, archaeologists can go dig them up, and I'm going to show you some in a few minutes. So the thing is, as soon as they could build spaces for worship and meetings for the sacraments, they did. So, all right, next question on this. So maybe the church needed facilities. So I used to make this argument back when I was in Evangelical, I was working in that world, back when I was working for Mel, and we were still on the same page. I used to make a distinction when I would meet with clients and pastors and stuff between facilities. So we'd say, what you do is you need a facility. Why? This was my talk, not talk track at dinner and stuff. I would say a facility facilitates your ministry. Okay? It's not a sacred space. That's when Mel pushed back on me and I said, hey, what Massimiliano Locatelli did to that poor church of St. Paul in Milan was sacrilegious and a desecration of sacred space. And he's like, there is no sacred space. It's a facility. It's just there to facilitate whatever you want to do in it. Well, our building's really sacred. Well, here's my contention, and this is the contention of the Catholic Church. And that is that yes, buildings can be and are sacred for at least two reasons. The first and the lowest level reason is this, is yes, because at a minimum, there is an honor due to and a respect that we owe to places that were built for God. Right? I mean, think about the respect of it. Anybody ever been to like Gettysburg? You go to a place like the Gettysburg Battlefield, don't you feel, you go to Arlington Cemetery or something, and you feel like you ought to be respectful of the space. If your kids are there and they're squirming around and spitting gum, you say, "Stop it," right? Show some respect. This is kind of a sacred space, right? We feel things that were important, things that were you know, so at a minimum, it seems to me that churches, whether they're Catholic churches or Protestant churches, things that were built for the glory and honor of God, are due at least a minimum level of respect. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, when I look at what that email that had my break with Mel about that church in Milan that they turned into an architectural office, I went, it just feels disrespectful, if nothing else. Yeah? And this is a big thing now. So one of the big cool things to do with all these empty church buildings now is to turn them into coffee houses and bars and brew pubs. And I've been to a couple of these. I got dragged to a couple of these things. I got dragged to one a couple of years ago that was very comfortable with here in Michigan. So this is a church. This one's in England. You can see it's been turned into a bar. This one is in Dublin. And, you know, cleverly, they simply call it, it's a cafe, bar, restaurant, and nightclub. And it's simply called a church. And they've taken an old church and turned it into a nightclub and a bar. And this one is in Ohio. So maybe Carla's been there. But it's a cool brew pub that's in a church. A few years ago, I was with some clients, and they were like, we totally want to go to this cool brew pub for dinner. And it was in Michigan here, and it was a church. It was an old Protestant church. And it was like this, that they'd taken the whole thing and turned it into a brew pub. And then all of the beers had like clever names, like Sermon Ale and, you know, whatever. And you know, and I was just really uncomfortable. And these were secular people. And they were like, oh, this is like super funny. And, you know, and I was like, I'm very uncomfortable sitting in this space sort of making fun of something, you know, that I feel like we owe some minimum level of respect. Whether it's an old Presbyterian church or not, it deserves our respect, right? Can we agree on that? So that's the first thing. But beyond that general respect, Catholics specifically believe that things can be made sacred by being consecrated for a purpose. Okay? Anybody ever have something consecrated for a purpose? Have you had the priest come over and bless your house? Yeah. Right? Bless your rosary? Bless your Harley Davidson? Right? And so those are general blessings, but there are also some items that are specifically consecrated only for holy use, right? So the vestments in the sacristy, right? The liturgical vessels that we use for the sacraments, right, are specific. Holy water, and the priest bless that. This is taking something that is common and consecrating it, setting aside, making it sacred, making it holy. And this is fundamental to Catholicism, the notion that things can be consecrated for holy use. And church buildings have been consecrated for holy use since the beginning of the church. I'm sure you got tonight. Now, the primary, but not the only consecrated sacred space in the Catholic Church is what? We go down the hall here. Where's the primary sacred space?
The tabernacle.
Where?
Sanctuary.
The sanctuary. And where is the sanctuary? Because it's different in a Catholic church versus a Protestant church. They use the terms differently.
At the front with the altar.
It's the area immediately around the altar. Okay, so it's the altar and the immediate environs of the altar. And when in the third week, when John and Jamie are here, because we're working with some architects right now to talk about moving our tabernacle, and we're getting consultation from the diocese and a firm the diocese recommended about, because you have to be very careful about where you can't just go stick the tabernacle willy-nilly somewhere. There are liturgical rules, and you're going to learn all about that in the third week. And where things have to go and why they have to go, but that the sanctuary is the primary space. But then there's other spaces in the church that have been consecrated, like, for example,
The nave,
The corners.
The nave is blessed, right?
Corners.
Where?
The corners by the bishop.
The corners.
Mhm.
Generally in a Catholic church, there's different spaces that are, one space that has been specifically consecrated in this building. This classroom. So when we launched Lane, if you recall, Bishop Wakowiak came here and he did a consecration. He was in his thing and he sprinkled the water right in this classroom. So you are in a space that has been consecrated right here for the purpose of doing this, of teaching, the Catholic faith. Now, in fact, I think there's a very good argument to be made for this based on Old Testament precedent. Okay? So, what's that? Did you recognize that? Nope.
it's like a manger.
Come on.
I know.
Sunday school, guys. Wait a minute. Catholics don't have Sunday school. What was the catechism class? Da, 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 da,
Look like there's some on there.
da, 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 da,
Sacrifice.
da.
It's all the lambs.
Yeah. That's the tabernacle. That is the mobile temple that the Israelites used before the temple was built. Do you remember? So when Moses is giving the instructions from God in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, particularly Exodus and Leviticus, God tells them on Sinai to build this thing called the tabernacle. It is a tent. It's a mobile tent structure. And it's the temple in miniature. So God has them build the tabernacle. And then if you recall, as the Israelites wandered around for 40 years, and a pillar of fire and smoke would lead them places, they would pack this up and they would carry it to where the pillar stopped, and then they would set it up again. And inside of it, you had a very particular structure, outer court, the sacrificial fire, you had inside a holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, right? The candles, right? All of these, right? Scroll of the law, all this kind of stuff was kept in here. And you can see that it was a mobile tent. Anybody ever seen this reproduced? There are several reproductions of this, and one of them came to Holland, I don't know, like 10 years ago. They set it up on the lawn at Beechwood Church, right there on Ottawa Beach Road.
Is that whole thing considered the tabernacle?
Yes,
That
we
whole-
use the word tabernacle to be that, but this was called the tabernacle. It was the
It's
entire,
not just
tent
the
structure.
tent, Art.
the
It's
entire kit and caboodle.
Everything.
This
that's
was the
enclosed.
tabernacle. And
Everything that's in that fence.
the fence and everything in it, that's the tabernacle. It was a mobile portable temple that the Israelites carried around. And the Ark of the Covenant was inside of it until Solomon built the first permanent temple. David wanted, if you recall, David wanted to build a temple, but God told him that he couldn't build a temple because of sin with Bathsheba. And so it fell to Solomon to build the first permanent temple. This is what the inside of the tabernacle looked like. This was the first temple, or this was actually the second temple, it's Herod's temple. There was the first temple by Solomon, got destroyed when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, hauled everybody off, and when they came back, they built the new temple, right? Remember this? And then Herod improved on it and so forth. So at the time of Jesus, this was the temple. And the temple was basically a reproduction in stone of the outline of the tabernacle. And here's a fun fact, by the way. God gave very specific instructions to Solomon for the construction of the first temple, including the dimensions and the interior dimensions of the temple. The first temple built by Solomon, which were given by God. Do you know where those dimensions were reproduced? No. I know Amy has been there because she and I were inside of it together.
Oh.
Mhm.
Do, 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 do.
Weren't they cubits?
Yes.
The Sistine Chapel with Michelangelo's frescoes. When Pope Sixtus built that, it was built to the exact dimensions that God gave Solomon for the first temple. Okay. And in the temple or the tabernacle, there are specifically sacred spaces. Like, for example, go back and say just this diagram is easier to see. You see this curtain. So this was the holy. Where's my? I have a laser. Except the laser pointer isn't showing on the white screen. Okay, so everything like in this front part here is the holy place. The priest can go, and then you see that big curtain. On the other side of the curtain is the Ark of the Covenant. See it? You recognize it because if you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, that's what Indiana Jones recovers. And that is the Holy of Holies. This is the holy place. That's the Holy of Holies behind that curtain. And the only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies, and he could only go into it one time a year to make this the Paschal sacrifice. And that is reproduced inside the temple, where you had the courts, the holy place, and then the Holy of Holies, which upon Jesus's death, the curtain separating the Holy of Holies is torn asunder. So in the Old Testament, everything in the Old Testament is a precursor to the New. It's giving us hints and forward suggestions. And so the notion of these spaces that are dedicated for the right worship of God and God's presence carried, and nothing in the New Testament says that should be separated. Now, the evangelical argument or whatever is, well, when the veil was torn in two, there's no reason for temples anymore. That's true. We don't have a single temple, but what we have is the principles of sacred space for sacred liturgy and the sacrifice of the Mass. Those principles that were foreshadowed in the Old Testament are carried forward in the New in the Catholic churches. So yes, buildings can be sacred. And after this temple was destroyed, the temple of Herod the Great, in the year 70 AD, the Romans leveled the city of Rome and destroyed everything. In fact, you go to Jerusalem now, nothing is actually where it was or looks like it. You want to go, where was this and where is this? You go, I don't know. The Romans leveled the place and tore it apart stone by stone, and so it's all been rebuilt since then. But nevertheless, okay, after that, do you know what the Jews, now I'm not talking about the Christians, what the Jews did is they created something called synagogues. And this was a Jewish synagogue. Actually, they created synagogues after the first temple of Solomon fell in exile. And if you look inside a synagogue from the first century, so remember Jesus goes to the synagogue of Capernaum or the synagogue of Nazareth? This is a first century synagogue, like what Jesus would have taught. And do you see some similarities architecturally between that and the tabernacle and the temple, and between the first churches? Okay, you have right there in the center what the place where the law is read, and then you have a little tabernacle. And you know what was in the tabernacle and the synagogue, or is in the tabernacle and the synagogue? Not Eucharistic hosts. You know what's in the tabernacle and the synagogue? The scroll of the law, the Torah. So when you go, have you ever been to a synagogue? You go to a synagogue, and the rabbi will go back there, whoever's going to read, and they remove the scroll of the law and then read it. When Jesus was in Nazareth at Capernaum, they did. And you know who visited synagogues? The Apostle Paul. His primary ministry strategy was to travel around the Roman world and go into any city and find a Jewish synagogue. Then he would show up on the Sabbath and say, hey, I'm an esteemed rabbi. I'd like to be the guest teacher today. And they go, wonderful. And so he would go take out the scroll of the law from the little tabernacle, stick up there to the little lectern, right? Like an ambo. And he would stand there, and all the people would be sitting in there. And then what Paul would do is go through the Old Testament and prove how Jesus fulfilled all the prophecies. That was Paul's missionary strategy. So, and when those people began to convert to Christianity, right, in the book of Acts and in Paul's letters, you see him going to these places and converting in places like Corinth and Ephesus and all these things, converting Jews. What did the Jews do? Well, in many cases, their synagogue became a church because now they were believing Jews. And when some of those people began to build spaces for their new, as Christians, what did they borrow from as an influence? The synagogue, which has a continuity back to the temple, to the tabernacle. So there is this long thread of continuity architecturally that runs from the tabernacle through the temple, through the synagogue to the church, of sacred spaces and how sacred spaces are designed and how they're utilized. I'm gonna stop, take questions. Questions, comments, yeah?
Okay, so if you're gonna pick apart things.
Yep.
And we say, I agree and I get that buildings can be sacred.
Mhm.
I'll take that. So, but if you would say, is this entire building sacred or are there sacred spaces within this building? Like your office isn't sacred,
No.
is it?
The sanctuary is the primary sacred
Right.
space, which is the area immediately around the altar, because that's where the sacrifice of the mass takes place.
Mhm.
In fact, it is an excellent point. No, my office is not sacred. Gosh, no, my office is sacred. And the copier room and the lunchroom there, I guarantee you, is not sacred. But for example, that's why when we launched Lane, we asked Bishop Wokoyak to come out here and consecrate this, bless this classroom. So what now? It's not consecrated for the sacrifice. We can't serve the mass in here, right? That would be completely inappropriate. But it's consecrated for the purpose of teaching. But the sanctuary is consecrated for the purpose of the sacrifice of the mass.
So you
Makes
can be
sense?
consecrated for different purposes.
Consecrated for a purpose, yeah. And the continuity in terms of architectural, how things are organized, where you can start to see some of this continuity in terms of architectural sort of forms that run from tabernacle to temple to synagogue to church. Seating area around an area, a tabernacle, the ambo, the teaching of the law, all these kinds of things. We'll get into this in a minute, but well, this is a good place to get into it. So look, on the left, you have a synagogue from 66 AD, dug up architects, and this would be a church from maybe a century later. Now, what's interesting is you see that there's kind of an altar space in the synagogue where the law rests. In the church, the altar is where the presence of the Lord is. But what is Jesus? He's the word of the Lord, right? So that altar that has the word of God in a synagogue is also, so an altar is a continuity. There's another continuity if we go back, and that is the mikvah steps and the baptistry. So Jews believed in a baptism, right? Because John the Baptist, the baptism of John. And so there was ritual washing. And in the original tabernacle and temple, there were this giant basin for ritual washing. And these are the mikvah steps. It's basically like a jacuzzi, like you step down into this little pool. And that's what the Jews would do for ritual washing. That gets carried into the baptistry in churches from the early years. So again, architectural forms, there's continuity. Okay. And one of the reasons that a building is sacred, a church building is sacred, is it's sacred because it is a container. Now, this is your point, where there's the sanctuary, and then there's the place the people sit, the nave, whole church, and that is a container. What does it hold? The church. The church, the people of God, right? Church, the people, here's the people, right? And the thing, you guys even know that?
I'm
Stupid, right? So right. So the thing is, yeah, church and the people and the people. Anyway, my big sausage fingers, I can't do it. But the thing is that right, and that's one of the reasons why Protestants call the whole seating area where the seats are the sanctuary. Why? Because for Protestants, it is the people of God that are collectively sacred, and there is no altar. Right? Protestants doesn't have an altar. So the sanctuary is all of us together being the people of God, not the specific area of the altar is. And when we get here, I gotta keep moving, but when we get into how the church began to change architecturally after about 1970, particularly in America and Europe, You start seeing a movement towards things that almost look like more Protestant things, because the emphasis moves away from the sacrifice and the real presence on the altar to our collective experience. Okay. All right. So let's kind of walk through these eras, and I'll show you some pictures. So what I'm going to start is kind of how the evolution of church buildings went from the first apostles up till now. All right. And the first place that the apostles met was where? The upper room, right? That's where the Last Supper was served. And remember, not just there, but that's where they were hiding out between Friday and Easter, right? And Sunday. And then when Jesus appeared to him, remember, he came through the doors and walked. And somehow he appears and, doubting Thomas and all that, right? And they continued to meet on and off in this room. Now, here's my deal. Again, I came into the church, as a 20-year-old college student in a very hippy-dippy, hipster, left-wing college campus, in Boulder, Colorado. And I was, we were, very, hippy-dippy and all that kind of stuff. And the thing is that we talked about the upper room, and here's what I think people do is they imagine, all of us do, we project back our culture and cultural assumptions into the past. We do this all the time with history. So what happened is we said, well, they were hiding out in an upper room, and what we imagined is it was like a rustic space with rough wooden timbers maybe, and some straw on the floor, and some wooden tables, and they were kind of hanging out, and right? This is how we imagine it, because in the 70s and the 80s, this was sort of an ideal, right? This sort of casual, rustic. You remember the 70s and 80s? They were super into the peasant shirts and flip-flops, and everybody was sort of into, it should be like, the church shouldn't be all this big, glossy, stained glass windows. Okay, I bet people back then were like totally into like rustic stuff, right? They must have been like a rustic upper room. Maybe you've ever been to the upper room? Or less. It's a rustic place with straw on the floor, like an attic. You go to Jerusalem, you still go there. That's it. It's called the Cenacle. It's the upper room. And it is a Greco-Roman space. Now, why? Well, you know why? Because Jerusalem was a Greco-Roman city. At the time of Jesus, it was a very much, the Greeks had been there for hundreds of years, the Hellenistic kings, the Romans took over. All of the architecture, after the return of the Jews, was Hellenistic, Greek, and Roman. And when we think of Jesus walking around in sandals, in this kind of like rustic sort of environment, that's not what Jerusalem, it's not what the places that Paul went were like at all. It weren't their cultural assumptions. They lived in a place that was influenced by Greco-Roman architecture and culture and civilization. It's very much what things looked like when Paul went to Ephesus and Antioch and Corinth and all these places, Philippi. He was going to these kinds of places. And the reason I bring this up is because our assumption, the first Christians, their cultural assumptions or their architectural tastes or styles, what they thought was normal. That's what they thought was normal. And in the 70s and 80s in America, we got into this sort of rustic, hip kind of sort of like mode, like that was what we people had guitars, and they probably had the flip-flops, and they wore and that wasn't what their world was like at all. Not at all. That was the world of Jesus and the apostles. And the reason I bring that up is that when they said, well, let's make a space to meet. And then we imagine it was somewhat rustic space. Or a house church must have been like people sitting around on sofas in a thing eating Cheetos. But that's not what their houses were like. And the reason I'm making this point so strongly is that there is an assumption that entered the American church, particularly in America, in the 70s and the 80s, because of what was going on for us culturally in the 70s, 80s, and what our cultural tastes were like, where we projected backward and said, surely the first Christians must have been like this. And we began to build and design churches and things were like this. It couldn't have been all this fancy stuff. And so in the 70s, 80s, we sort of turned our back on history. And we imagined that the early Christians had a very different culture than they really did. And we know this is the fact because we can actually go dig these places up. Some of them are still standing, or you go dig them up, like, archaeology. There it is. We're not making this up. That's what the early church was like. And so the architectural, that's what the topic of this class is, the architectural styles and continuity that we saw running into the church in Rome and the church of the Middle Ages and the Baroque period and the church basically right up until 1970. These were all the architectural influences, not rustic wooden spaces and people hanging around in living rooms. But man, we loved that idea in the 70s and the 80s. We listened to John Denver albums and whatever, but that wasn't what it was like. That was the upper room. Now, then we had this idea of house churches. This is what I saw. I said, I'll put my credibility as I planted 3 churches out of my living room in my career, Linda and I did. But I'll tell you this about house churches. We assumed back in the 80s when I planted my first one, 80s, 90s, and when I was doing student ministry as a young pastor and everything else, we met in living rooms at people's houses. We're going to go to so-and-so's house, we're just going to be here, it's going to be Bible study. And we would read, and they had house churches. And you know what our assumption was? Their house churches must have been like our house churches. Surely their houses were kind of like ours. Like people went over, we're going to go over to Jerry and Julie's and we're going to hang out and she's going to, make some snacks and there's going to be some pizza. And we're all going to sit around the sofas and, right. And we'll all kind of hang out and like do a Bible study and it'll be super casual. But again, that's cultural projection backwards. Because that's not what houses were like. A Roman domus was not much like your living room at all. Now, this went on for a long time in the mid-century where there was this kind of idealized notion of what the house churches must have been like. And this was like, I don't know, like in the 70s, I think it was. They dug one up. The earliest known existing architectural house church. It's in a place called Dura Europos. And that's in Syria. Like where ISIS was and all that. Because Syria at the time was a Roman province, a very wealthy Roman province, and a lot of the early church was in Syria, Roman province of Syria. Antioch, where the church, got its big start, was in Syria. Syria, it was terrible when ISIS came along and they destroyed all of these ancient Christian structures. Well, Dura Europos was a town in Syria. And guess what? They dug up the earliest known house church. Now, it dates from around the year 200. Okay? But, hey, like a lot of houses from the year 675 aren't still standing, right? But this is the earliest extant one that we've dug up. And here's kind of what the design plan looks like, the floor plan. And you can see, and I'll show you a different thing. This is without labels on it. You can see kind of open courtyard area because a lot of Roman style houses or domuses have an open courtyard in the middle. Okay, built around that. And you had this large, it was a building, a domus. So a lot of these house churches were in, like if you have somebody in the church who's a wealthy individual that has like a Roman villa, you would meet at their house because they could accommodate everybody. And a lot of these things were converted. So that's what this was. It was a Roman villa, a Roman domus. It was converted. And let me put the labels on here. Okay, you can see over on this side, this is worship. My red dot doesn't want to show up against the screen.
G.
So I wish I had a pointer.
They're labeled as letters.
Okay, see this guy here? He's got like an altar. And there's a bunch of people sitting here worshiping. And then there's this courtyard area where I guess maybe that's where they had donuts after church or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the back, way up there, F, See what they're doing? They're having a class. That's like their lane classroom. That's Sunday school. And over here, this is like a narthex place where you come in. And you see that little thing at the top, E? Way up in the top right corner? You know what that was? The baptistry. It was a sunken thing, little pool that you step down into. And all of this is covered with these amazing frescoes. So the Europa's house church is full of all of this fresco. Now this looks degraded because it's like 2,000 years old, right? But at the time they were bright, vibrant frescoes. This is a fresco in that church that were adorned walls. And does anybody want to take a stab at what that is a fresco of? Okay, so you see one dude standing here and you see another dude and he's got something on his back. What's he got on his back? It's a cot. See the little legs and the little netting? That's a cot. That's Jesus healing the paralytic and telling him to take up his bed and walk. And here's what's interesting. Look at the guy who's standing there. That's Jesus, right? Because he's telling the paralytic to get up and walk. What do you notice about the way that Jesus is represented there? What's he wearing? A hippie robe? A Roman toga. And he's got short hair, like he looks like a Roman. Now, in other words, the people in that day, they were very much a Roman culture, and they were putting this in their context, and they had beautiful frescoes talking about Jesus was, here portrayed in their Roman context, telling this man to get up and walk. Here's another one. This is a series of women, and they have torches, and they've got little veils on them. And you want to take a stab at what the ladies with the torches and the veils?
The wedding.
And Jesus' parable about the bridesmaids and the bridegroom, right? Some of the bridesmaids were foolish and didn't have enough oil for their thing. So the inside of the Europa's house church, which and you can see as I showed you, it's pretty big. I mean, 50 people could be in the worship space, plus the Sunday school room, plus this, plus that. Pretty good size, and structured and organized like a church. A domus, a house church, but it was a villa that had been converted to a house. And it was full of beautiful liturgical art. This is the baptistry. And you can see that it was a font. You actually step down and full of all this beautiful art and frescoes. And this is a reproduction of it they have in the museum in Syria. That you would step down in this beautiful space. So the reason I'm showing you all this is the things that we look at in Catholic architecture and go, beauty, organized spaces dedicated for purposes, right? Liturgical space, baptistries, areas for the holy sacrifice of the Mass, areas for teaching, and then covered in beauty, beautiful frescoes, biblical scenes, beautiful decoration. These were operational in the first generations of the church. These were not innovations of the Middle Ages or the Renaissance that got corrupted, and then in the 70s and the 80s we decided to take it all back to the way it was when it started. That's an assumption on our part, which isn't fair. Now, the next era would be what I'd call underground churches, literally the catacombs. And here's a misunderstanding. Amy and I've been to the catacombs. I got a picture of us here. But in the catacombs, Christians did worship in the catacombs, and they were persecuted. And at least one of the popes was executed in the catacomb that we went to, and they held masses down there, but not all the time. Okay, this is a topic for another day. But the Roman persecution was episodic and localized. So in other words, the Romans would go all barbaric and persecute the Christians in a particular city for a few years, and then it would ease off, and another emperor would come, and he wouldn't press it as much. And then in another city or another province, a Roman governor would crack down on the Christians. And then, so what we have is in the architecture and the historical record, we have the record of Christians even in the second and third centuries, where they were places where they had the kind of thing I showed you at Europos, or they had these olive churches that I'll show you. They had church buildings, but at times and places they had to go underground. And in the catacombs, so there's something like 200,000 Christians buried in the catacombs under Rome. If you've ever been to the Roman catacombs, This is what they're like. You just wander through level after level after level, and literally 200,000 to 300,000 Christians are buried in the Roman catacombs. There's just several of them. Okay. These are the catacombs of Domitilla, which is the ones that we went to, but there's several others. I've been to some of the others. And you wander through, and this is like all lit, it's dark. And we're not going to tell a story about a particular person in our group who got us lost down in there for
Wandering around.
20 minutes and got us in trouble. But his name is Kentwood. And but we wanted until the Italian lady found us and yelled at us in Italian. It was pretty colorful. But anyway, it's easy to get lost down there. Now, what's interesting is that there's certain spaces in some of the catacombs of Domitilla where you'll be going along. There's all the tombs, and then they'll have like an open space where they could have worship or have a mass. And in these particular catacombs, there's a couple of places where there are several popes that are buried there. And there's a story of a pope who was serving a mass or celebrating a mass when Roman soldiers came down and arrested him. And so at times they would go down and hold masses there. And again, these weren't just empty spaces. So here's sections in the catacombs where you can see, once again, beautiful liturgical art. Now, I want you to fix this in your mind. So we're going to talk about beautiful liturgical art. It's always been part of the Catholic Church. It's always been an element in our churches from the first days. The house churches, catacombs, we've always adorned our church with beautiful liturgical art. From day one. Until like the 1970s and 80s when we stripped it all out.
Do you know, Greg, about what time period the catacombs would have been used more?
Sure. Well, from the earliest days of the Christians, so that would have been like the Great Fire in Rome, the execution of Peter and Paul would have been 65. That was the Neronian persecution. So in AD 60, the summer of 64, fall of 64, there was the Great Roman Fire that burned half of Rome, and then the Emperor Nero executed Peter and Paul several months afterward, the year 65, and from that time on, Christians began to bury their dead underground, and that persisted for about 200 years, on and off, until it became more established for the Christians to be able to not bury their dead underground. But there was literally hundreds. I think in the catacombs of Domitilla, where we were for a couple of hours, Amy, I think there were 30,000 bodies, and the catacombs of Domitilla there that we went to is the only one that still has bodies in it. There's still bones in there that they don't disturb because it's still okay. But do you see what I'm saying here about the beautiful art? And those are biblical scenes. You see on the top a picture of Jesus. These are the saints. Here's Christ and the saints. Here are other biblical scenes. This is a fresco that's on the top of that one chamber. Obviously, that's Jesus. And what are those two symbols on either side of it?
Alpha and Omega.
Yeah, the Greek letters Alpha and Omega. So as you stood in there and you looked up, you saw this kind of beautiful liturgical art. What do you think that is? That's in one of the chambers in the catacombs there. Beautiful fresco.
Good Shepherd.
The Good Shepherd. Notice he looks more Roman than he does like a hippie contemporary Jesus. But now this is in Domitilla, and there is actually a basilica church that was built in there. So a little bit later, like more around the year 250, 275, 300, they actually built a basilica church in the catacombs of Domitilla. And you can see that Mass is served there and has been since then. And here's our group. There's Amy. And in Maryland.
Was that above ground or catacomb?
This is in the catacombs. Yeah. So you can see there's actually, it's kind of at the edge of the catacombs, and there are kind of where the side of the hill is, they cut punch windows out so that some light can get in. But you can see that the Christians from the earliest days were building things, and there's continuity. Now, this has been reconstructed because over the centuries it fell down. And the reason those pillars are there is that the pillars were in the original one from the year 300. And of course, it's been collapsed, and in recent years it's been excavated and reconstructed, and they preserved the pillars. So when the Christians were there 1,700 years ago, they would have had pillars along the side, and again, all this beautiful liturgical art.
Okay. So what I'm trying to and then we have the hall churches. The hall churches is basically a Latin word "alla." It basically means like a big assembly space. And essentially what happened, there's some examples of it, won't get too deep into it. Here's one in Leuven. But essentially, they would either build a basic square building with an apse or something where they could worship, or they would convert buildings. There's actually a story of a Roman governor who said there was a building, basically like we do today, where like, hey, the Kmart is available. So my friends over here at Getty Church in town, it's like, hey, Kmart's available, we'll buy the Kmart. And they converted it. And there was a story of a Roman governor where there was something like a kind of a big tavern or something. And the Christians said, we want to use it, and they converted it. So there was these kind of hall churches that they had. And then we get to a real important thing, and kind of last one I want to show you before we move on, but these are basilica churches, okay? Now, we talk about basilicas. We have a basilica in Grand Rapids, right? We have 4 major papal basilicas and something like 80 minor basilicas. No, a couple hundred minor basilicas around the world. There's 4 major basilicas in the world. They're called the papal basilicas. They're all in the city of Rome. And they are all, even though they're all not in the Vatican City State, they're all considered sovereign territory, like an embassy. So even though they're in Italian territory, just like if you go to another country, you walk into the American embassy, that little building is considered American sovereign ground. There are 4 major papal basilicas in the world. And now, for Final Jeopardy, who can name the 4 major papal basilicas? First one's again, come on, what?
Well,
St.
Peter.
St. Peter's Basilica.
St. John Lateran.
St. John Lateran.
Take credit for that one.
We went to all
Mary
of them.
Major.
What's that? Mary Major,
Mhm.
Basilica of Mary Major, and
Come on,
Basilica
Marilyn.
of St.
Oh,
Paul outside the walls. Okay, and that's where Paul's tomb.
That's where
is.
the noisy kids were.
That's where the noisy kids were, though, in barbarian invasion. We were in there. We were walking up to Paul's tomb in this incredible reverent moment, and the back doors of the basilica opened, and like 200
Field
like
trip.
middle school kids on a field trip came in, and it was like our guide's like, it's the barbarian invasion, and they came screaming up to Paul's tomb, and then she started yelling at him in Italian, and they got him to shut up. But the thing is that those are the 4 major papal basilicas, okay? And then there's minor basilicas. But what is a basilica? Okay, we talk about basilicas. What is a basilica? Well, a basilica has an original meaning and then a meaning that has developed over time. The meaning that we use today is it's called a basilica because it's an important church. So the basilica here in Grand Rapids has a little umbrella in it. It's like an umbrella-looking thing to indicate that it's a minor basilica because the Pope has declared it to be a church of historical or artistic significance. But basilica had a very technical term, okay, at the time of the Romans. And it was a kind of building. And it had a very particular architectural form. A basilica was basically a town hall or an official government building. Okay? An official government building was a basilica. It's where you went to the court. Like if you had to go meet a magistrate to have a matter, got looked at courts, or to get a fishing license, or to talk to the government officials. It was basically like City Hall. Okay? So a basilica. And the Romans built them to a standard architectural form. Because once they figured out how to build this thing, then it was easy for Roman architects to go to a new city and go, build one of those. And everybody who was in the city would come and go, oh, that's the basilica. That's the city hall because, it looks like a basilica. So here's the traits of a basilica. Now, this is the basilica that stood. It doesn't stand anymore, but it stood in the Roman Forum. Okay? And the traits of a basilica was that they were rectangular. The length, the width was between 1/3 to 1/2 of the length. So in other words, if it's 10, if it's 100 meters long, it would be 30 to 50 meters wide, rectangular. It also had a peaked roof down the middle with a series of windows that are called clerestory windows. Now, can you see the row of windows at the very tip top of that building that run along it, right below the roof line? Those are called clerestory windows because when you're inside, they're right under the roof and they shine in from the top. And the basilica always have those. And then the interior of the basilica, so there are literally hundreds and hundreds of these around the Roman Empire. This is one from somewhere. You can see the same basic thing, the clerestory windows at the top, basic structure. And this is the interior structure. Okay. Now, if this started to look familiar, it should, because we're starting to get into how Catholic churches are designed in continuity with the past. So what you see here in this floor plan, basic structure, and then do you see, I guess my pointer doesn't work, but do you see these dots along here? These are the main pillars to hold the roof up. See here? And then you see the central section. That central section is where that higher peaked roof is with the clerestory windows. So what you have is you have this high center section, the ceiling's really high, clerestory windows, and then you have a lower section here that kind of juts out and underneath pillars. And these side sections are called, you know, the aisles. And the center section is called the nave. And then do you see this thing here? This is where you enter. So the doors are here, and there's this narrow space there that you come into, and it's like the waiting area. You come in and prepare yourself to go in to court or to see the magistrate or to see the governor. Does anybody know what this is called? Because you ought to recognize it. Anybody ever been to the cathedral in Grand Rapids? Anybody been to St. Peter's Basilica, St. John Lateran? They all have a narrow space like this, and they're all built with a basilica form. And what is this little space here called? The lobby? The waiting room?
Today we call them the gallery.
No.
The
narthex.
The narthex, because it's where you prepare yourself to go in and meet the governor or the magistrate or do whatever you are there to do. Have your case decided. You go into the narthex, and it's a transitionary space of preparation. And then you see this area here at the end that juts out, a little semicircle. Anybody want to take a stab what goes there in a Roman basilica? Guess where the governor sits? Where would you sit if you were the governor? At the end, in a little raised seat, right? And then people have to come down the middle to you. And then you have all these functionaries and people in the side aisles, and you go into the narthex and your number gets called and you get to come in. And guess what that little round thing is called? Where the governor sits. The apse. A-P-S-E. Okay, been to a cathedral? Because when you go into a cathedral, what you see is exactly this. So, okay, this is a basic basilica church. Because what happened is when the Christianity became legal, they began to convert basilicas, existing Roman basilicas, into churches. And when the church built new churches, it built them on the basilica model, the basilica floor plan. This was actually the floor plan of the old St. Peter's. You do know, though, that the St. Peter's in Rome is the new St. Peter's, right? It's like the new St. Peter's is only like 500 years old. The old St. Peter's stood there for 1,200 years. It was built in the 300s and it lasted till the 1500s. 1,200 years, the old St. Peter's stood. That's a picture of it. And here's its floor plan. You came in, this was an atrium, a portico. Then you went into the Then you went into the central nave, and it had two side aisles, and those little dots are pillars dividing the side aisles. And then you come down to the end, and they added these little arms off the side that are called the transepts, because they look like a
Cross.
And then you have an apse where the altar sits, where the Roman governor used to sit. That's where the altar is. Go to the cathedral in Grand Rapids. It's basically modeled on this exact model, because this is the model for how churches were built. This is what the old St. Peter's looked like. And you can see the clerestory windows at the top. See the transept, see the apse hidden by there. See the side aisles, the narthex. That's the St. Peter's that stood for 1,200 years, and they knocked it down to build the new St. Peter's that we go to. Now, this is a typical Roman Basilica church in Europe. You can see the side aisles under the pillars there. You can see the clerestory windows at the very top shining into the nave. You see the apse down at the end where the altar is. Does that look like a lot of Catholic churches you've been into? Because they were all built on the same architectural pattern. Here's another one. This is like every Catholic church you've ever been into until 1970. Side aisles, apse, clerestory windows, nave. Recognize that, Amy? That is St. John Lateran. Interesting quick story. I'm running out of time, but interesting quick story about St. John Lateran is that it was owned by the Laterani family. We just called that. It was a palace basilica by one of the Roman aristocratic families. And when the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, he felt like the Pope needed an appropriate place to be to do his business, and so he gifted the Pope the Laterani Palace, which was converted into a church, St. John Lateran. And it is the diocesan church of Rome. So when the Pope acts as the Bishop of Rome, he does it from here. When he acts as the Pope of the worldwide church, he does it from St. Peter's.
And that's a cathedral then.
Yes, that is the Cathedral of Rome.
Yeah.
And it's a basilica for that.
What's the difference then? What makes something a cathedral?
Because it's the seat of a bishop, and we did an entire Lane video last year about that, and we will link that for you. Because the seat of a bishop is always called a cathedral. It's where it is this cathedral, and that is the seat of a bishop.
And it can be a little two-room church in some rural area.
Yep, it can be anything, but if that's where the bishop has his seat, a lot of times it's not the biggest and prettiest church. In fact, one might argue that our basilica is a more beautiful church than our cathedral. But the cathedral of St. Andrew is where the bishop has his seat.
And it has a very formal seat in there. That,
Yes, the bishop has a literal seat.
Mhm.
So that's John Lateran. That's the front. What they did is they took that basilica and they stuck a facade on it. They did a lot with these conversion churches. This, real quick, and I'm going to get off this topic, but this is the original floor plan of St. Peter's up until the very end, because it took like 200 years to build St. Peter's. And do you know when they first designed it? It was going to be this shape. It was going to be what's called a Greek cross, where the four arms of the cross are equal. And that's how it was designed. And then what happened was they got very close to finishing it. And what happened is they said, well, it just doesn't have enough seating for all the people who are going to come here. So they tacked on the nave and aisles on the one end and made a Latin cross. There's a lot of controversy in the architectural history about that. Okay, and then Gothic cathedral churches, real quickly, because this is going to be a history of architecture, but Gothic churches basically follow the same floor plan. So this is your typical Gothic church in France or England. And you can see it has the same idea. It has a narthex, it has aisles around the nave, it has an apse, transepts. What they did in Gothic churches, here again, good example. The choir is that area behind the transept, where literally the choir sat. And what they did, though, is they began to change the design. So you take away those clerestory windows and create more windows, make it taller, more beautiful. They used various architectural techniques to allow more light in. So this is Chartres Cathedral in France, the most beautiful ones. And you can see that what they did is, but it follows the same floor plan. That's the point I want to make. This was the inside of a Gothic cathedral. This is Saint Denis in Paris. But again, the same floor plan, the same structure. Okay, real quick then, at the end here. So what happened then? Okay, that's how Catholic churches were designed. And that's the history of how our sacred spaces were from the time of the upper room until about 1970. And then something super weird happened in the 60s and the 70s, and the entire architectural concept of the church changed in American Europe, because the concept of Catholics began to change, and their concept of what they thought the church was and what it was for began to change. So here's what happened
Costs too much money.
in the 70s. These are examples of Catholic churches that were built in the 60s and the 70s. This one is in Switzerland, I think, or Germany. Does that look anything like anything we've seen up until now? You're starting to build them round, out of concrete. No adoration, no adornment, nothing to make them beautiful. No windows.
Like St. Francis of Assisi.
Our Lady of Concrete. Look at this. This one's in Germany. Now, notice a couple things. The seating is in the round. Where is the nave? Where are the aisles? Where's the apse? Where are the transepts? All gone. And going back to when we looked at the upper room, or we looked at the catacombs or the house church in Syria, where's the liturgical art? Where's the beauty? Where are the things that remind us of the stories of Scripture? Going back even to the tabernacle and the temple in the Old Testament, where's the liturgical beauty? Where's the adornment? It's a big, ugly, naked space. And what you have is structure. And what I mean by structure is literally the things that hold the building up. So there's no adornment. You know, you go to a Gothic cathedral and you covered all of those pillars and things with frescoes and beautiful things. You go all the way back to that beautiful thing. Here's the paralytic. Here's the, you know, the virgins, you know, with their torches. Here's this, here's that. Nothing. All gone. All gone. What we get is beams. We sit in church and on the round and stare at each other and look at the beams. Look at this one. Also in Germany, I think. Boy, that's inspiring. Where's the art? Where's the beauty? Where's the scenes of Scripture? Where's the adornment? Where's the liturgy? Well, do you see what this is? This is a radical break with the 2,000 years up until. So what I've taken is I've shown you from the upper room that the disciples had the Last Supper in, all the way up to the 1960s and 70s. And it was like 1,900 years of this, and then went boom, radical cut, bam. 1,900 years of continuity. And in fact, if you go back to the Old Testament with the tabernacle and temple, you might argue there's 3,000 years of continuity to the time of Moses. And it was simply cut off. And we began to build stuff like this. Church in the round, empty things. I look up at beams and concrete structures. There's no focus in the architecture of the altar being back. There's no apse. What they are is we all sit around and look at each other under beams and structures. Look at this one.
Did that break occur before Vatican II?
It's right after Vatican II.
Or after that?
This Vatican II was in the 60s, and right in the 60s at Vatican II, this is what we began to do. Now, this came into the Church in America, because if we go down the hall here, what do we have? A church in the round. And what do you look up? What do you see when you look up? Wooden beams. Where's the liturgical art? Now, we do have 2 stained glass windows, but short of that, where's the liturgical art? Where's the beauty? What we do is we sit around a circle and we look at beams.
Yeah,
Go to Muskegon, to Our Lady of Concrete, as the priests jokingly call it. Go over to go to St. Francis of Sales, wonderful church, wonderful parish, but a big concrete thing. And this is what we built, and this church, all these churches were built in the 80s, in the 70s and the 80s in America. So what I just showed you, these were in the 60s and early 70s in Europe. It took about 10 years for that to migrate to the American church architecture. And in the late 70s and the 1980s, the Catholic Church in America began to build stuff on these models. And if you look at these, you'll see elements. Sure, we're not, but I mean, can't you see there's elements of this that are all drawn, even in, you can see elements of that drawn into even our building that we're in right now, the round circular peak roof, you know, the concrete The structures, the lack of adornment, circular seating, wooden beams and whatnot.
Is this still the current design, if you will, or criteria?
Well, so that brings me to the end. Two quick things that we're kind of at 8:30. So let me tell you two last things. We'll kind of wrap this up, and then next week we'll pick that up here. Two things. Part of that was a radical break with the past. There was a real sense after Vatican II that we wanted to be done with all of that. I could go on for another hour and a half about the logic of all of that. We wanted to see all of that stuff from the past as something that we were shedding. We were shedding all the baggage of the Catholic Church, and we we're going to be free of all of that. And the idea was that if we got rid of all of that art, we got rid of all of that, all of that stuff that we spent looking at tonight, we got rid of it, would just be us, and it would free us up to be a community, and the excitement wouldn't be in what's around us, it would be in us, amongst us. And it would cause the church to explode with evangelization because it would reach contemporary culture. So the question is, has the church exploded in evangelization since the 70s and the 80s? Has it worked? But here's the thing. What you have now is a whole field of Catholic church architects in the United States that are going around now and taking Catholic churches that were built in the 70s and the 80s and renovating them to bring back some continuity with the past. Okay? The architects that we've been consulting with that were recommended to us by the bishop's office to move our tabernacle, who you're going to meet, John and Jamie, in the third week, they've done 8 or 10 or 12 churches here just in the last couple of years. They did St. Peter's down in Douglas. They just finished that. They did the new St. John Paul II up in Cedar Springs. They're doing St. Robert's right now in Ada. They're doing St. Mary Magdalene. We're going to go see those on the fourth week, and they're going to walk us through and show us how you're taking these things that were built in the 80s without adornment, without liturgy, without all of the continuity, and trying to, because, you know, it is what it is. And when we sat down and we said, we can't change the basic structure of our building, but if we're going to move the tabernacle in here, how do we position the tabernacle so that it's beautiful? How do we, you know, put things in there so we begin to bring back some sense of continuity with our Catholic heritage and continuity with the past? And how do we bring those elements in? And so their firm, Progressive AE, they're the unit in Progressive AE, which is a very large firm that does Catholic Church, and they've done 8 or 10 or 12. They're recommended to us by the bishop's office. And they've done so far, I mean, Jerry, you've seen their ideas are amazing, where they looked at the space and said, you know, if we just move this a little bit, we just did a little bit, and here all of a sudden this starts to feel like a sacred space again. And so we're very excited about that. We haven't shared anybody because we're not doing anything yet. We're just getting some concept ideas, and then those will be shared with the parish very soon. But we wanted to at least work with there's a committee at the diocese and the bishop's office of made up of some priests with experience in this area, Aaron Sanders, the director of liturgy, and some architects in the diocese. And this committee approves. You can't put in a tabernacle and altar or make any alteration to any church in the Diocese of Grand Rapids without it going through the design being approved by the bishop's committee, make sure that it's liturgical.
That's not a bishop's recommendation, by the way.
Yeah, he needs a recommendation and he has to approve.
It's not a recommendation.
Yeah.
It's an order.
Yeah. Well, when we said we wanted to move the tabernacle, they said you don't get to move the tabernacle without the bishop's permission. And then we said, and then what we were specifically told is the committee in the diocese doesn't want any DIY, do-it-yourself, bungled messes where people start just hanging stuff in there and moving things around. You need a liturgical architect who understands the history of liturgical architecture and understands the principles and the canonical requirements and can bring that. But part of it is this whole idea of restoring. You know, you're never going to turn a church from the 80s into, you know, St. Peter's Basilica. That's not the point. The point is, how can we look at some of the things that we look at tonight and bring some continuity and connection with our Catholic heritage into our space and create that sense of the sacred and also that sense of embracing our Catholic identity And I think what happened is in the 70s and the 80s, a lot of churches were built that basically broke with our Catholic identity. And that's why so many churches in America, I can just, there's whole websites for Catholic, this whole community of Catholic churches that are being renovated and changed. And so that's what we're going to see at St. Robert's on our 4th week. They're going to walk us through the things in Ada, the things they're doing at St. Robert's, things they did in Mary Magdalene in Kentwood. And we're going to see 2 examples of that kind of renovation. Questions, comments?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Comment, because you made the comment about, you know, taking a church sacred space and doing something else with it. I mean, we're facing that with St. James and Grand Rapids.
Yeah.
I mean, it's up for sale.
You know, it's really sad because, you know, space, because sometimes the churches, they have to, right? I mean, the Catholic Church, if you listen to the podcast, or whatever, I've done a couple of episodes where I've talked about the statistics of the collapse of our numbers. I mean, the church in America now has about, you know, 1/3 to 1/2 the number of people that it did in 1970. And so what you're seeing is parishes being combined and parishes being closed all over the country. And then what do you do with these spaces? You know, they have to deconsecrate them. So a bishop actually has to come out and deconsecrate the space. Interestingly, I don't know if I should be telling the story. Maybe I guess I'm going to, and then it'll be recorded and I'll get in trouble. But we've had several proposals come out of Our Lady of the Lake over the last 5-6 years that have floated up to build a Catholic cemetery here on our property in the prayer garden, either a cemetery or what's called a ciborium, where you bury ashes in urns, and that so that some of us could choose to be buried at the church. Because when you go to churches, old churches, you like I you know, I want to walk out to the churchyard and see. And interestingly, we have 3 times now we have approached the bishop's office and said, we have room at the prayer garden, we have a lot of acreage out here, we would love to. We have some donors who have offered to help to make that a reality, and we've been told no 3 times by the bishop's office, because their policy is, I'm sure this won't happen right away, their policy is, what happens if a church closes and we have to sell the building and we have a bunch of people buried on the grounds? And so, like, well, of course that's never going to happen already late, but there's a policy of, well, we have to be careful with our property because we never know what's going to happen.
The old church I used to live in 50 years ago, they have a section in the church set up for ashes, but it can be moved out of there if that church fails, or rather is abandoned. The whole set of ashes can go someplace else. Where the problem, I think, with the bishop here is, who can guarantee that this will be a church 100 years from now?
What if it turns into a right? I mean, and that's the thing is, you know,
or a Muslim temple.
Where, as a Catholic, am I supposed to be buried in Holland?
I don't know.
Well, when my wife,
I still worry more and more about it every day, the older I get. I would be the first guy to buy a couple of plots for my wife and I in the prayer garden if I could.
Well, my wife is buried at Lakewood Cemetery, and Father Charlie came out and blessed the gravesite as the internment. And
I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole of the cemetery thing, but the point I was just trying to make is, you know, Michelle made an interesting point where you're closing parishes, and there is a concern about that. So how you use that property. But look, you know, we started this thing. I told you my story about can buildings be sacred, and how I kind of lost my former quasi-employer over that. But in any case, I began to believe that buildings can and should be sacred, and they should be sacred spaces. And then when we go back and look at some of this, does anybody think this looks like a sacred space?
Me.
It's almost, to my mind, you know, from an artistic and architectural sense, it's almost militantly anti-sacred. It's almost making a statement. You know, this to me, this makes a statement. And it's a statement of a break with Catholic identity for thousands of years. And so, like I said, you know, there's oh man, if you want to sit around and while you're watching TV and go down this rabbit hole on the internet, there's wonderful websites and examples of all around the United States where Catholic churches are taking their space that was built in the 70s and 80s and making them beautiful again. And there's a whole market. So one of the things we like to do is we've got some exciting plans. Jerry's been a part of these. Some exciting plans to have some beautiful art in our liturgical art in our narthex and in our nave and in our chapel. And the thing is that there's whole markets for used beautiful liturgical art, because all of these beautiful Catholic churches in America that were built 100, 150 years ago that have closed, there's whole warehouses of beautiful stained glass, beautiful icons, beautiful pieces of, you know, statuary, all this stuff, and they're sitting in warehouses. And there's actually vendors where, you know, you go, we would like something beautiful for this space or that space, and it comes out of a, you know, church from, you know, Boston 100 years ago or something, you know, that was built. And so you know, it's a whole thing of people trying to do this, and that was why we were so impressed when, you know, I know Ralph Hensley, you know, we all know Ralph down at St. Peter's, and he hired this same firm, and they've done a beautiful job of renovating St. Peter's. They did an amazing job up at St. John Paul II in Cedar Springs, and make that something special. And then what they're planning, and several others in Grand Rapids, and then IHM and a couple of others. But what they're planning at St. Robert's is very equivalent to the kinds of suggestions they're making to us. Is one of the reasons why we want to go see St. Robert's, because they're saying it was a building built, and we've got some same kind of ideas of how we bring, you know, beauty back to it. Okay. Yeah.
Comments from an OF. You know, when we grew up, all of our churches were built in the 1800s.
Yeah.
Very Gothic with the nave and aisles and altar, all similar, all beautiful. Catholics always had a St. Mary's side and a St. Joseph side flanking the altar.
Yeah.
I've come in here, there's a St. Joseph. Where is Mary? The Mother of God. She's gone.
Well, and we're Our Lady of the Lake. So those are the very things.
Nowhere to be
That's
seen.
the very things that we're looking at. We have some very exciting ideas. I'll just tease you a little bit. You know, this all began at Our Lady of the Lake because we talked about replacing our tabernacle. So this is like the thing where you're going to remodel, change your cabinets, and before you know it, you're remodeling your house. And we wanted to get a new tabernacle. And because our tabernacle, the gold plating inside of it is wearing out, and the lock was broken. And so way back with Father Mike and Father Charlie said, we need to replace the tabernacle. And they said, well, if we replace the tabernacle, maybe we should think about moving it back to the sanctuary. And then we said, but if you move it to the sanctuary, then where in the sanctuary does it go? And where would it be approved to go? So way back before COVID, Father Mike and I had some meetings with the bishop's office. And then they were like, okay, well, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then you guys need to get some consultants in here, liturgical consultants, to do it the right way, and yada, yada, yada. And here we are. But then they go, well, if you're going to move this and you're going to put the tabernacle, you know, here, then, and one of the questions is, well, then that raises an interesting question of then in the chapel, you know, would you make any changes? And I'm just going to give you a little tease that the current thinking and recommendations are that our chapel would become a chapel of the Rosary.
It would be what?
A chapel of the Rosary, Our Lady of the Rosary.
Oh,
And that what we would have in there is on the walls a beautiful liturgical art of all the Rosary mysteries. And so it might be a very beautiful space dedicated to Our Lady of the Rosary. And you know, that's not a for sure thing, but there's just all the ideas that are kicked around, and lots of ideas to look back at some ones that you can't change. Like one of the things I always thought was crazy when I first got here is there's stained glass up in the peak, but you can't tell what it is because there's beams in the way. I can't tell what the pictures are. So there's a lot of things about it, where you just look at all of this visual structure and beams, and it's kind of dark. And so they're looking at things that we could do in there that you can't fundamentally change the structure, but there's things that you can do that are interesting, that would make it more beautiful and bring some elements back.
We just got a crucifix only 4 or 5 years ago. We didn't have that.
That's true.
Step by step. So yeah. Well, anyway, I've held you a little bit longer, but I'm here to answer your questions or any conversation you want to have. Next week, what we're going to do is, might be fun, I know some of you can be there or not, but what we're going to do next week is we're going to look at some of the most beautiful, famous and beautiful Catholic churches in America. So National Cathedral, Notre Dame, St. Louis, there's some really remarkable, beautiful, beautiful churches. And one of the places we're trying to get to on our November pilgrimage field trip is to Notre Dame to see the Basilica of the Sacred Heart there in the grotto. And so there's some really wonderful things. So we're going to next week, I'm going to have a whole big slide show you like the 10 most beautiful Catholic churches in America, and we'll talk about the elements that are in them and what makes them beautiful, and a little bit of their history. And then we will send out some links, Carla and Corey send out some links to some videos, including the American pilgrimage videos that give you some history of the Catholic Church in America. That's kind of background for what we're looking at. Okay? Super. Thank you.